Hello, ghouls, and welcome back to our read through of The Libertines, Day 6. We took a bit of a break yesterday for the class, but we're back in the game. So you've probably forgotten some of what was going on because there's so many plot lines and it's so confusing. So I'll give you a little bit of a run through where we're at the moment, as far as I understand it. So Alexo, with his companions Alfonso and Clorinda, and Jacques have just escaped from his uncle's castle, where he sort of ended up randomly as he was escaping something else. But they were helped by the servant Pedro, who earlier in the book's been evil, so I'm not quite sure how safe they are, but they seem to have escaped. Also, Bertram and Cleanthe were still prisoners, I think, of the evil uncle, Rodrigo. And in the other storyline, Father Jerome had just triumphed over all of his enemies / ex-Confederates, the Caras and Bessari, sent them to the Inquisition, had them kill themselves, basically. Do you think that's where we're at? I think so. That's where we're at to the best of my understanding and knowledge. So let's just get right into it. We've still got a couple of days worth of reading, and we want to finish definitely this week. So it's chapter 8 we're starting with today. And let me just read the epigraph for you from Mason, which says, "Hell from her gulf profound rouses at thine approach, and all around her dreadful notes of preparation sound." Sounds like a Jerome chapter to me. Let's see. Although Jerome triumphed in iniquity, without a rival, his mind became the prey of the most tormenting sorrows. He found no comfort in religious reflections, for having mocked and despised them in his heart, they afforded him no consolation in those hours when the mind, weary of sublunary pleasures, seeks to repose itself in the anticipation of comforts beyond the grave. Sometimes he would leave his cell at the hour of midnight and wander in solitary and unfrequented walks. Sometimes he would meditate among the tombs in the burying ground of his convent, but in contemplating those awful monuments to our mutability, he was soon unusually overpowered by the piercing sensations of horror. The shades of the many victims to his cruelty glided before his eyes as he paced with unhallowed steps the consecrated earth. His consequence, his power, his authority soon became the subject of general contempt amongst those who before trembled at his word. For when intelligence was received at St. Catherine's of Bessare's death, a sister from the convent in a provincial town was appointed to succeed her in the office of Lady Prioress, and a few nights after she was installed, the unfortunate Amantha came to the gates of the priory and demanded admittance. Her story being told, she was instantly received under the protection of this abbess, whose piety and benevolence endeared her to all the sisterhood of her own monastery, and to those who knew her without the walls. Jerome was then, for the first time, positively denied admittance into the convent of St. Catherine's, and the monks of his own order gave him to understand, by private marks of contempt, that they only waited for a favourable opportunity to banish him from the sect with infamy and disgrace. "Am I," he would cry, "to be made the sport of female arrogance and monkish indifference? Is friendship to be estimated only in proportion as we extend influence and authority? Have I lived to be deserted by the sycophants that so late revered the very earth I trod upon? They shall find me quick to feel their scorn and severe in my revenge." One evening, as he sat at the window, observing the sun beautifully illume the heavens, a man from the prison rapped at his door and brought him information that some unknown gentleman had been at the council chamber several times, and special conferences, in consequence of their appearance, were held continually amongst the inquisitors. "There is a fellow," said the ruffian, "whose name is Pedro. He says he knows you and sends his respects to you." "Damn him!" exclaimed Jerome, with a wild, terrific stare. "Had the devil but been in possession of that villain's soul, I should have triumphed over the malice of my enemies. I'm totally lost. He knows my character well. Go back to the prison and watch the conduct of the officers. Procure, if possible, intelligence as to their proceedings through the means of the secretary. He is not proof against bribery, and you shall not fail to be rewarded. Look to what I command. Sincerity has been uniformly displayed in your conduct. Desert it not at this critical period. Go. Remember, I have been your friend." The ruffian retired. "This is the time," cried the monk, "when the secrets of my heart involve me in the deepest horrors of reflection. Nature seems to be enthralled with one cold and icy chain that binds me to anticipation and distress. I cannot quit this scene of misery. My steps are watched. The villain Pedro hunts me from the abode of men. If the circumstances related by the assassin should prove true, shall I suffer myself to be exhibited at the auto de fe, a martyr to the vengeance of an inquisitorial judge? No. Sooner shall some fatal drug close these eyes in endless oblivion than the last moments of my life be devoted to public penance upon the scaffold. Here some person rapped loudly at his door. He cautiously inquired who was there, and finding it to be the ruffian from the Inquisition, admitted him. "Oh, it's all over with you," exclaimed the man. "Orders are issued to examine the secret cells and hiding places of your convent in St. Catherine's, and I fear that you're the principal object that they're in search of." "They shall have me," cried the friar indignantly, "but not to hold me up to public scorn or torture me at the peaceful hour of death with flames and exhortations." "You have sensibly obliged me," he cried, and threw a large purse of valuables upon the ground. "Leave me, and keep your counsel." At that instant the porter of the convent entered his cell and delivered him a billet which, he said, was left at the gate by a youth of about 15. No expressions can paint his horror and confusion when he read the following words. "Jerome, Alexo is in Madrid. Although the death of the unfortunate Francis has deprived him of the means to bring before the state inquisitors testimonies of your guilt, which must have inevitably damned you to death, yet no opportunity will be lost to effect it. Alexo." "The time has come," cried the terrified friar, "when confession may administer comfort to my sinking spirits." He sat down and wrote the following letter. To Don Medea de Grado, Grand Inquisitor. This letter contains the private confessions of a man whose life has been devoted to the blackest of human villainies. Murder, robbery, and debauchery have constituted the chief part of his studies. The sacred altar has been profaned, vows violated, and the consecrated tombs of saints converted into dungeons for the victims of his treachery. He has been taught by his religion to hold as a sacred fact the certainty of salvation, if absolution could be administered to the dying before the soul departed from the body. And if penitence can now shelter him from the vengeance of his God, how glorious was the hour when first he imbibed its conciliating and adored precepts. He relies upon the faith of the Catholic creed for the mercy of his God. He implores the forgiveness of sins that mankind are taught to expect from contrition. The night is far spent, and he shudders at the approach of day, for at that hour you will find his body, but the soul will be precipitated into eternity. Observe and execute the following commands. Confessions. The beautiful and once beloved Cleanthe, daughter of Don Alfonso de Berida, whose death has been generally admitted, is alive. Yes, she lives, to triumph at the fall of her enemy, her betrayer, her deluded persecutor. Clorinda is confined in a castle, the property of one Rodrigo, uncle to Alexo, formerly a monk of my own order, and which stands in a valley near a range of mountains that are contiguous to the town of Maydis in Old Castile. Let the owner be seized and questioned concerning her. If he refuses to deliver her up to the officers of justice, let a female of low stature and deformed be threatened with the rack, and she will instantly discover the place of her concealment. Her mother has escaped from my possession, and her retreat has not yet been discovered. Her father is in exile. Amantha, whom I purposed with the assistance of Decaris to murder in the chapel of St. Dominic, is now living with the abbess of St. Catherine's. The clock struck the hour of 12. The pen dropped from his hand. He started from his seat. "What is this," he cried, "that thus appalls my sinking spirits? Are the vitiations of hell to be endured here and hereafter? Oh, God!" He pressed the crucifix to his lips, but that holy talisman failed in the effect. Its power in restoring comfort to the wretched was now no longer acknowledged. He dashed it to the floor and turned to finish his confessions, but observing in the sky streaks of light that foretold the approach of morn. "I must away," he exclaimed, "and procure the means to save me from a public exhibition. My cell must be my grave. I cannot rest. The torments of hell surround me. The very air seems infected as I breathe, and nature groans beneath the load of my infamy. Tomorrow, great God, tomorrow, and I shall discover the awful mystery of eternity." As he was hastily proceeding through the cloisters to the laboratory for a medicine, to root out the written troubles of the brain. 2 men, habited as alguacils, seized him by the throat and dashed him on the ground. He struggled, but in vain. They bound him with cords and conveyed him to a dungeon in the fatal prison where he had so often exhibited his villainy and despotic authority. The next night he was led to the private judgment hall and examined at the tribunal. He there observed one of the inquisitors who condemned Bessare sitting in judgment upon him. He ordered 4 persons who were standing in a circle at the extremity of the apartment to advance. They approached, and when the monk perceived that they were his accusers, when he saw the ill-fated Clorinda with Alexo standing before him in person, he shuddered with signs of the deepest horror, and lifting up his eyes to heaven, he exclaimed, "God be merciful." As they were proceeding to put some questions to him, 2 officers who had been sent to search his cell arrived in the judgment hall and produced the paper containing his unfinished confession. As the secretary read the first, Clorinda shrieked aloud and sunk lifeless upon the floor. Terror and confusion reigned in the bosom of everyone present. He was remanded to his dungeon, and as he passed back to his prison, he was reviled and almost struck at by the torturers whom he had so often employed and so liberally rewarded for the acts of villainy. Sic transit gloria mundi. When Pedro heard of the confession of Jerome, he recollected that a lady was brought at midnight to the castle of Rodrigo upon the mountains, but no one ever could discover what became of her. Officers with a party of soldiers were dispatched, attended by Alfonso and Alexo, to surprise the castle and seize the domestics with their master. Pedro, accompanying them as a guide, rode furiously before them. It was late at night before they arrived at the valley, and on reaching the gate of the castle they found it open and the place totally deserted. They entered the hall and ranged over the edifice with caution, searching every part with the greatest strictness, but no human being was found. As they were proceeding to examine the ruins near the spot by the light of their torches, they discovered a woman turned swiftly into a solitary avenue. "There's the old beldam," said Pedro, "that managed the affairs of the household at the castle, and whom, if you recollect, we saw sleeping before the fire in the hall with old Conrad the porter." They instantly pursued her, and before she could escape, came up with her. "By St. Denis," cried Pedro, "you are likely to meet with a reward for all your tricks now. Come, no whining. Go with us to the castle. We want a little information, which I have no doubt you can give us." She was hurried into the great hall, and upon examination declared that the cavaliers, her masters, had been apprised by a ruffian from Madrid of Jerome's critical situation, and knowing that he could discover the place of their retreat, they had fled away and left only her behind. "But," said Alfonso, "in what secret place is the lady confined that was brought here some time back about midnight by 2 ruffians habited as officers of the Inquisition?" Come, cried Pedro, taking a pistol from his belt. "Be quick in answering that question, or dread the consequence." The old lady immediately sunk upon her knees and exclaimed in the greatest agitation, "Oh, spare my life, and I will conduct you directly to her prison." This they promised, and she led them to the ruins, when, after traversing a variety of subterraneous passages, they arrived at a small tower, where they found Cleanthe stretched upon a bed of straw in the most melancholy state of existence. The feelings of Alfonso overcame him, and he swooned in the arms of a soldier. The unfortunate victim of villainy was taken from her dungeon and conveyed to the hall of the castle, where a fire was lighted, and the wretched girl informed that she was restored to liberty and the protection of her father. She fixed her eyes upon her surrounding friends with a terrific glare, and when Alfonso called her by name, she started from her seat and, supporting herself against the wall, exclaimed in a voice of wild and disconsolate frenzy, "I do think my artifice is so shallow to convey me back to that hellish monster Jerome. Why am I to be distracted with a repetition of ills that never can be rooted from my memory? Let me return to my dungeon and make that bed of straw my grave. I'm weary of my life. Bertram is dead, and I would that I were laid by his side, for the world is filled with villains. His spirit has often whispered to me that amongst the angels in heaven I should live in peace and happiness." "Am I so altered," said Alfonso, pressing her withered hand affectionately, "that you cannot recollect your father?" "Father?" she exclaimed, shuddering with horror. "I have no father. Great God! They tore him from me with cruelty and injustice, and now perhaps he wanders through the world friendless and in beggary. Religion is a curse upon mankind. It deals in blood. The Holy Father Jerome murdered my mother, but she is in heaven, and we should not disturb the spirits of the blessed, nor speak of the dead but in prayer. Oh, my head. She burst into a flood of tears and sunk lifeless into her father's arms. Whilst they were anxiously waiting her recovery, a soldier came in, almost breathless, with the intelligence that the old woman had discovered the retreat of the robbers, and that his comrades were engaged in a desperate conflict with them. The greater part of the group which surrounded Alfonso and his daughter immediately ran to their assistance, whilst a few remained in the hall to protect them from violence. As they attentively listened to every noise which entered along the galleries of the building, they perceived through the Gothic windows a great light in the air. A man entered the hall and cried aloud, "The north wing of the castle is on fire!" They immediately hurried with the distressed Alfonso and his almost expiring daughter to the plain before the castle, and continued watching for the event of a circumstance so extraordinary for some time. The flames rapidly increased, and fearful that the robbers might be masters of the field, Pedro was dispatched for the horses that were secured in the valley. He soon arrived with 2, reporting that the others had broken loose and strayed away. Alfonso seated his daughter in the best manner that he could before him upon one, and ordered Pedro and Alexo to mount the other, and made for the village he had conducted them to on the former flight from the castle. On their arrival at the village, refreshments and necessary comforts were immediately procured for Cleanthe, and as the morning advanced, Pedro was dispatched at the head of a body of peasantry who had been greatly infested with the robbers, under the deceitful appellation of holy monks of benevolence, to assist the soldiers. On their arrival at the scene of action, they saw the castle still in flames, and making for the valley, met the soldiers dragging along with them 3 ruffians in the habits of friars, bound with cords. "Hello, my brave fellows," cried Pedro. "I have brought here a body of reserve, but I see you have conquered these infernal fellows." Aye, said one of the soldiers. "And warm work we've had too. Where are the gentleman and the lady?" "Oh, they're safe," answered Pedro. "Oh, that's well," said the soldier. "The villains thought they were apprised of the castle being on fire, and I dare say they expected they're consumed." The rest of the troops soon after made their appearance, bearing some of their wounded companions. The ruffians were conducted with great triumph to the village, and from thence to the metropolis, and lodged in the prison of the capital. Alfonso arrived at Madrid by slow stages, 2 days after the entry of the soldiers with their prisoners. It was thought prudent to convey Cleanthe to the house of a friend until she was sufficiently recovered to meet the piercing sensation which an interview with her mother would unavoidably occasion. Clorinda, the instant her husband entered the house, flew to meet him, trembling and pale with fear, lest he should not have accomplished the object of his journey. She started with terror when she found him alone, and eagerly embracing him, inquired for Cleanthe. "She is safe," said Alfonso, "but fearful an interview so unexpected and distressing might operate with bad consequences upon her mind, not yet recovered from the effect occasioned by her sudden delivery from prison. I have procured her a residence in a friend's house for a few days, until her strength will permit her to see you. She is sadly altered, Clorinda." They both were drowned in tears, when Don Bertram entered the room accompanied by Alexo and Amantha, whose death he had so affectionately lamented in the forest, but whom he found, from the confessions of Jerome, to be alive and residing in the convent of St. Catherine. After the usual expressions of joy for each other's good fortune were over, Amantha, at the request of Clorinda, accompanied her husband to the house where Cleanthe resided, and attended upon her until she was sufficiently recovered to see her mother. This interview soon after took place. A scene of most affecting sorrow cannot be conceived, or more affecting sorrow cannot be conceived. The mother, drowned in tears, supporting her almost expiring daughter. The father, as if inspired by the agonies of grief, offering to his God the prayer of gratitude for his merciful protection, whilst the surrounding friends mingled their tears with those of the once wretched family of Don Alfonso. All formed a picture worthy to be illustrated by the bold and fascinating pencil of a Raphael or a Correggio. When Alexo was to retire to rest, a message came from an inquisitor that a person who was examining before him wished to see him, upon matters that related materially to his interest. He immediately accompanied the messenger to the tribunal, and found the person before the judge to be his uncle Rodrigo. "You are, no doubt," said the culprit, "surprised to find me in this situation. But when I tell you that I have been the captain of a band of robbers and in close connection with Jerome, your inveterate enemy, for many years, you must call it a miracle that I have escaped the punishments due to my crimes so long. Alexo, I am persuaded from the evidence of that rogue Pedro my death is certain. But before I am condemned, therefore, by this holy tribunal, for reasons justified by the conviction that I am restoring to you nothing more than your right, I return back the deeds of your estates, entrusted to me by your father. You will find them valuable and uninjured. He delivered the papers to Alexo, and pressing his hand affectionately, bade him a last farewell, and the examination proceeded. When the citizens became acquainted with the circumstances of Don Alfonso's family and the tricks of the impious and debauched friar, it was a topic of conversation at every table and public place of entertainment. The trial of Jerome was looked for with a degree of anxiety never before experienced by the public mind, and the curiosity to see the unfortunate victims of his cruelty increased more and more every day. At length the day arrived when the hall of the Inquisition was to be opened for the trial of Jerome, but the people were informed by a proclamation that the Holy Inquisition, conceiving a public trial to be inconsistent with the accustomed mode of proceeding, had tried the friar privately and banished him to a convent at a distance. "Banished?" exclaimed Alfonso as he accidentally read the proclamation in the streets when he was proceeding to the hall with Clorinda as an evidence against Jerome. All eyes were upon him. He shuddered for the consequences. A letter dropped into the secret box of the Inquisition would have doomed him to a perpetual and miserable existence in a dungeon for such a speech. He returned to his home and consulted upon the best means to preserve the peace of his family from the violence of future ecclesiastical atrocities. He knew the metropolis of a great nation must unavoidably contain the evils he wished to avoid, and the monks, he conceived, and with truth and justice, would not in the least suffer in their reputation by the public testimony of Jerome's immorality from the bigoted prejudices in favour of their adored supporters of absolution and remission of sins. As Jacques had accepted a commission in the army, he determined to quit the capital and retire with his family to a paternal estate in the kingdom of Aragon, where their future days might be spent with comfort and uninterrupted by the vicissitudes of fortune, the artful dissimulations of church and state, and the damnable injustice of the Inquisition. He communicated his intentions to his friend Don Bertram, who resolved without hesitation to accompany him with his daughter Amantha. The loss of his son now preyed upon his mind, to a degree bordering almost upon melancholy. Almost. And retiring into solitude he conceived would be more conducive to his happiness than living amidst the noise and bustle of the metropolis. Sorry. Almost a bit miffed that my son's missing. When Alexo heard of this determination, he requested a private interview with Bertram. It was granted. "The stranger," said Alexo, "who sent for me to the judgment chamber of the Inquisition, Don Bertram, was my uncle. Grown hoary in the exercise of impious desires, he has now fallen a victim to the laws of his country. Conscious of his certain condemnation, he returned me back the property my father left me, and which he had stolen from me by the artifice of forcing me into a monastery. Amantha's life was saved by me, and since the discovery made by Jerome of her retreat, I have entertained an unconquerable and affectionate regard for her." Bertram interrupted him. "'Tis not for me, Alexo, that these confessions should be made, but to the object of your affection. Tonight, if you will, make your appearance at the house of Alfonso. The subject shall be discussed, but for the present we must separate." Alexo had scarce taken his leave of Bertram when he was accosted by Pedro in the street, who petitioned to become his faithful valet and humble follower. Ere the conversation was finished, and an answer given to Pedro's request, two men dressed as alguacils seized Pedro by the collar and dragged him away to prison. Unfortunately for poor Pedro, Rodrigo in his confessions discovered a few tricks of his companions, and them too of such a nature as procured him, notwithstanding all the interest made in his favour, a public whipping in the marketplace and banishment to the galleys for life. Bye, Pedro. The long-expected hour arrived when Alexo was to hear the sentence of the Inquisitional Court of Matrimony. He went to the horse of Alfonso at the hour appointed, and after waiting some time in the antechamber, was ushered into the room where Bertram and his daughter waited his approach. "Alexo," said the Don, "I have communicated your wishes to my Amantha, and she returns your love for love. Take her, Alexo, and know that it is to you only that the title to my daughter's affections belongs." As soon as the necessary preparations were ready, the nuptials took place at Madrid, and the parties, with Alfonso and his family, set out for their retreat into the kingdom of Aragon. The new abbess of St. Catherine's, on hearing of Florella's flight from the convent, requested that notice might be given in every church and convent in the metropolis for her to return to her order. This circumstance produced an inquiry concerning the fugitive nun, and she was discovered in the house of an underporter to the Inquisition, who, no doubt, held her in trust for the purposes of Jerome, but alleged in excuse for his conduct that he detained her only until an opportunity should offer for her to return in safety to the convent. She was received into the nunnery with all possible regard by the sisterhood, and joined in the general joy at the establishment of order, regularity, and virtue in a house that had been sunk into disgrace by the profane and abandoned conduct of Passari. The honour of confessor was abolished by the intercession of St. Anna with the minister of state, and all intercourse with friars entirely cut off, as the first step to preserve the continence and character of the nuns and the nunnery. For some time, however, after Jerome's banishment, the abbess appeared unusually low and thoughtful. She seldom frequented the little musical parties amongst the sisters, which she at first patronized with eagerness and pleasure. But she sought out at evening the most retired parts of the garden to weep, as was observed by the nuns, over a letter, which she seemed to peruse with a degree of sorrowful pleasure. Every vestal studied to afford her comfort and assistance, but she dismissed them with smiles and affectionate caresses. One night, after the hour of 12, when Florella had retired to rest, some person rapped at the door of her cell. "You may come in," said she, "for I have not barred the door." It was the abbess. She started with astonishment. "Be not alarmed, my daughter," said Anna, as she pressed her hand affectionately to her lips. "I am come to sit with you. My mind tonight is not free from its unpleasant reflections, and I want consolation." Florella immediately quitted her bed and dressed herself, and as she placed the picture of her mother in her bosom, exclaimed, "I always take great care of this treasure. It's the picture of my mother, of her whom I left when an infant and have not seen since our separation. To me it is dearer than life, for it has preserved my person from the most violent and brutal outrage." Here she accurately related to St. Anna the atrocious conduct of Jerome, but before she had concluded her story, the abbess rose from her seat and, clasping Florella to her bosom, burst into a flood of tears. A mutual silence for some time prevailed, when the abbess broke from her embraces and, fixing her eyes steadfastly upon the nun, drew a letter from her pocket and gave it her to read. The contents were as follows. To the virtuous and benevolent prioress of St. Catherine's. There is a nun now, I am afraid, a wanderer upon the world by name Florella. She was formerly of your convent, but fled from it under some apprehension that Passari would rigorously enforce the laws of the order for a trivial fault. If she should ever return, and perhaps when I am no more this may be the case, look upon her as your daughter. Treat her with compassion and kindness. Love her and protect her, for she is the child of him who addresses you. Oh God, it is signed Jerome. The letter dropped from her hand and she sunk lifeless upon her bed. The abbess had scarce recovered her when the matin bell rang for prayers. They went together into the chapel, and as they returned, the morning was just breaking. After wandering for some time along the shady walks of the garden, to feel the refreshing air that blew along the avenues, the abbess recommended Florella to lie down upon her mattress and compose herself. "Tonight at 12, said she, "you may expect me at your cell, when I will explain the dreadful mystery." She affectionately embraced her, and they separated at the entrance of the cloisters. Florella spent the day in her cell, overpowered by sorrow and anxiety. She counted the clock as it struck the hours until the time of midnight arrived, when she stepped softly into the gallery. It was quite dark. She listened with a degree of impatience scarce to be conceived for the footsteps of St. Anna, and the light of a lamp at length beamed upon the wall fronting the staircase, and in a moment afterwards she saw the abbess appear, bearing, as before, a lamp and a crucifix. When she entered the apartment, Florella's health was inquired after with tender anxiety. "I am much better," she replied, "but my mind will ever dwell upon that incident of my life with the most poignant horror." "Let it not," said the abbess, as she seated herself beside the side of Florella. "For my sake, be the means of making you unhappy. You are indebted to God for your preservation, and to me for your misfortunes. The tale which I am about to relate to you may appear strange and unaccountable, but it will discover truths that cannot long be concealed from the world. Florella. I am the daughter of a poor cottager who lived in the kingdom of Aragon and supported his family, consisting of my mother and myself, by industry and hard labour, until the hand of God swept him from the world. This misfortune happened when I was about 18. The year after the loss of my father is memorable by the death of my mother. Deprived of two affectionate parents, I was left a young and unexperienced orphan on the world, in poverty and destitute of friends. A neighbouring cottager, who had worked with my father in the forest, gave me an asylum in his house until I could procure for myself a situation in some family. The castle of Donastura was not far distant from the village where I resided, and one evening, as I was weeping over the grave of my mother, a gentleman in a hunting dress accosted me and affectionately inquired into the cause of my sorrows. When I had faithfully related the misfortunes I had experienced, he desired me to appear at the castle the next morning, and in the interim he would recommend me to the Lady Astura. I was at the castle by the time appointed, and the same person appeared in the hall and desired me to follow him. I did so, and he led me into a room where I found the Lady Astura sitting at an organ. She immediately rose from her seat, and listening to my distresses with the tenderest compassion, promised me her countenance and protection. I lived in the family for some time, in the capacity of attendant on her ladyship's female companion. I loved at the time of evening to wander amongst the romantic walks of the beautiful gardens, and listen to the parting songs of the birds that sheltered themselves in the solitude. I could play a little upon the lute, and delighted to practice my most favourite songs in a grotto at no great distance from the grand walk that led to the castle hall. One evening, in the height of summer, after I had finished my store of songs, I sat at the window to contemplate the grandeur of the hanging clouds as the sunbeams shone upon them with unusual splendour, when my reflections were disturbed by the appearance of our confessor. He approached me with respect, and taking hold of my hand, requested I should indulge him with a song. I complied, and he seemed enraptured. He flattered me. He embraced me. My heart was open to dissimulation, and believing the most violent and inconsistent protestations, I looked upon him as my affectionate protector. Our friendship, or rather I may say love, increased every time we met. And to feed my vanity, he had my picture taken by an Italian artist who came to finish some fresco paintings in the concert chamber. But I too soon discovered the effect of my imprudence, for I found myself pregnant. Yes, my Florella, those untimely interviews gave birth to you. You are the offspring of Jerome and Santana. She clasped her to her bosom in the transports of passionate affection. No sooner was my situation discovered by the servants than I was ordered to quit the castle. An horrid idea! Found in Jerome, my seducer, a most inveterate persecutor. He represented me to the Lady Astura in the most despicable light, and insisted upon my being driven from the castle as an object unworthy of her protection and regard. In vain did I assert my claim to pity and candour. In vain did I request to tell my tale. All ideas of humanity seemed to have deserted her on the occasion, and I was thrust upon the world in ignominy and disgrace, a friendless and disconsolate wanderer. It was a severe night in winter when I saw the castle gate shut against me, and strolling into the woods adjoining the grounds of Donastura, I threw myself upon the ground, in hopes that death would put an end to my sufferings before the morning. But I was awakened from a light slumber about daybreak by the forester, who compassionately took me again to his cottage, and suffered me to remain there until I was brought to bed. About that time his wife died of a fever, and at his request I stayed with him for 3 years after my delivery. It was then that I determined to quit the world for ever. Jerome, I was informed, had left the castle to supply a vacancy in the order of St. Dominic at Madrid. This circumstance gave fresh vigour to my expectation, and accordingly one evening I fled from the cottage, leaving you to the care of the forester with the following letter. The wretch who leaves with you her daughter is tired of existence in the world. She seeks a sanctuary of nuns. If you take the child Florella to the castle, the Lady Astura will provide for her. From the time I entered the convent to the hour in which I discovered you, I could gain no tidings whatever of your fate. My applications to the forester were fruitless. He constantly replied that he carried you according to my directions to the castle, and had never seen you since. I endeavoured by means of the porter to learn something concerning your fate from the family, but in vain. Let us forget, my dear Florella, the name of your unfortunate and iniquitous father. I am now mistress of an asylum where the footsteps of impiety shall never enter to disturb the hallowed tranquillity that reigns within its walls. My life shall be devoted to religion, and may the horrid example of Jerome be considered as an awful instance of the Almighty's vengeance when his name is blasphemed by man. St. Anna inquired how Florella came by the picture. The Lady Astora, said she. When she sent me to this convent, gave it to me and told me it was the picture of my mother, which was presented to her as a specimen of beautiful painting by Jerome. Keep it, said she, as a sacred emblem of a victim to the most artful villainy, and look upon me as your friend and protectress. Her death happened soon after I entered the convent, and ever since that unfortunate event, I have indulged no hope of meeting with a friend in the world. The abbess clasped her to her bosom. But in me, said she, you find a mother. At this instant, footsteps were heard hastily pacing along the gallery. I cannot find the abbess, someone exclaimed as she passed the door of the cell. My God, what shall we do? St. Anna entered the gallery. She was instantly surrounded by several nuns who exclaimed, Oh, mother, Melissa is at the point of death. She raves in distraction and constantly calls upon the name of our deceased abbess and Florella. St. Anna inquired into the cause of her insanity, but no one could inform her. The cries of Melissa now echoed along the gallery. It was near morning. The sun shines, exclaimed the distracted nun, but to illuminate my dark and hellish deeds. Bessari invites me to the clouds, but she sits upon a throne encircled by a flame of sulphurous fire. Oh, Florella, pardon me. Catherine, that bloody form still visits me. Down to the grave. A solemn pause ensued, and the abbess, attended by her nuns, proceeded to the cell, where the unfortunate female lay naked on her mattress. As they entered the apartment, she sang the following song to an affecting and melancholy air. I'm not going to sing it, just read it, sorry. Every night and every morn, by a sister's cold deathbed, I have dwelt a while to mourn the sufferings of the sorrowed dead. No flower or hallowed shrub grew there, no yew tree waved with sullen gleam, naught but Melissa's silent tear bedecked the murdered Vestal's tomb. She burst into a flood of tears as she repeated the last line. The abbess spoke to her. She looked piteously at the surrounding sisters and began to sing again. The abbess ordered all the nuns to quit the cell, except 2 of the elder ones, whom she requested to attend upon the distracted Vestal. They remained with Melissa during the day, and at midnight sent a message to the abbess that she wished to see her. St. Anna ordered them to retire to rest, and she found the nun considerably better, and seating herself on her couch, requested to know if she had everything she desired. Yes, said Melissa. I want nothing but peace of mind. She looked wildly at the abbess. There is a God, St. Anna, and they say he is just and merciful. The abbess took her by the hand. Be comforted, Melissa, and if you have any circumstance upon your mind that tends to aggravate the severity of your distressing malady, disclose it to me instantly. I will, said the nun, shuddering with horror and folding her arms around her neck. But let us first go to prayers. The abbess complied with her request, and mass was said by her bedside. After the ceremony was concluded, the nun begged that no person might be in the room while she disclosed to her the secret which brought on her disorder. When the abbess was left alone with her, she began in the following manner. Look upon me as a murderer. Detest me as a fiend of cruelty. I have broken my vows and violated the sacred duty of daughter and friend and sister. Bessari, the late ill-fated abbess, was my mother. Our lady, look not so stern upon me. She was an abandoned female and instilled into my mind the principles of cruelty and injustice. She murdered Catherine, daughter of Don Juan de Castillas. She was called Jugurtha to deceive the sisterhood. Great God, exclaimed the abbess as she rose from her couch. Stay, cried the terrified nun. You shall not leave me. You promised to hear my complaints and comfort me. No hope of forgiveness left, said the distracted nun as she burst into a frantic fit of sorrow. Lord God of heaven! The abbess continued. To precipitate into eternity the soul of a friend is to incur the most severe indignation of God. Friend, cried the nun as she started from the abbess. Catherine was dearer to me than friend. She was, by the laws of our religion, my sister. Her bones lie hid beneath the floor of this cell, but they shall not be removed, for I have prayed and wept over them until they have become dear to me. She was barbarously murdered. She paused. There is a whispering in the room. Hark, hear you not a sigh? The abbess again attempted to quit the room. Melissa grasped her firmly by the hand. You shall not stir from this place, she cried sternly, until you have heard the conclusion of my story. It's a damnable and hideous deed, I acknowledge, but my mother forced me to execute it. Yes, Vasari stood over me while I plunged this dagger into Catherine's heart. She drew from beneath the bedclothes a bloody poniard and gazed upon it with an inexpressible look of horror. Vasari shrieked. Melissa shrieked, presumably, but the nuns had retired to rest, and silence reigned in every part of the gallery. A dreadful pause of some minutes ensued. The cause of her death, said the nun in a kind of whisper, is her being pregnant by a holy friar. I knew him well, but he now moulders in his grave. His name was Francis. I have ever repented the deed, and whenever an opportunity offered, I haunted him to distress his mind for thinking of such a bloody scheme. Oh, Vasari was a wicked mother. She turned suddenly towards the abbess. Florella, too, she cried, has been the victim of my iniquity. It was I, St. Anna, that advised Jerome secretly of all her haunts. It was I that laid the scheme for her ruin. It was I that detained her in the porter's house, purposely for the base designs of Jerome. Tell her that I beg her forgiveness. The abbess, no longer able to endure the horrors that the nun's confession occasioned in her mind, rushed from the room and fled precipitately through the gallery, calling aloud for the sisters to appear. It was soon crowded with affrighted nuns. She related to them the situation of Melissa and begged of the sisterhood to go instantly and attend her. They arrived too late. The unfortunate nun was found weltering in her blood upon the floor from a wound given by her own hand, with the dagger that was encrusted with Catherine's blood. They raised her from the floor and endeavoured, with the assistance of Miranda, the sister physician, to stop the effusion of blood, but to no effect. The dagger had, by repeated strokes, penetrated too far, and Melissa soon expired in the greatest agonies. The abbess, after the accustomed ceremonies used on such occasions were performed, desired the body to be removed into the chapel for interment, and attended by the whole sisterhood, she raised the floor of Melissa's cell and discovered the mouldering bones of Catherine. She had been buried in her dress, and the rosary and cross remained entire. Horror and distress reigned in her bosom. All recollected the mysterious circumstance of Jugurtha's disappearance, and the solemn procession on the occasion, when the abbess gave out that she was taken to heaven in the night by an angel. The mystery was now unravelled. The bones of the unfortunate Catherine were collected and deposited in the tomb which was before erected to her memory, and the remains of Melissa interred in the vaults belonging to the chapel of the Inquisition as a mark of disrespect to her character. Solemn and pathetic dirges were annually sung by the sisterhood at the tomb of Catherine, which was looked upon as a shrine sacred to the sufferings of innocence and virtue. Her cross and rosary were deposited in the church amongst esteemed relics, and her fate kept a secret from her friends and the public, to prevent the disagreeable consequences that would inevitably have resulted from the discovery of such a barbarous proceeding. The convent now became the seat of happiness and strict devotion. St. Anna, having been the dupe and victim of religious artifice and deceit, justly thought that the confessional chair of the order was more fit to be occupied by one of her own sex than the young lusty friars of St. Dominic. She therefore presided in it herself. It caused a great tumult amongst the holy men of the day, but she succeeded in her scheme, and on those days which were dedicated to the saints, she usually heard confessions. The convent chapel was then open to the public. And one evening, as she sat in state in the confessional with her ears placed against the aperture, a voice whispered, "Suppose, lady, I should, in those desperate hours of love when naught is thought of but the attainment of the object of our hearts, suppose, I say, lady, I should break through the barriers of religion and steal away a nun from your convent. You will be punished as you deserve by the Holy Inquisition." As the person withdrew from the spot, St. Anna peeped through the aperture and discovered a tall man wrapped in a soldier's cloak with a military feather in his hat stalk down the aisle of the chapel. It was near midnight ere she had received the ridiculous confessions of all the penitents present, but her mind was too much engaged in endeavouring to unravel the mysterious question put to her by the stranger to afford the delinquent much consolation by her answers. She had not long retired to rest when she heard some persons under the garden wall with music. She rose instantly and opened the windows. The night was calm and beautiful, and as the soft airs floated upon the breeze, she listened to them with an unusual degree of rapture and attention. In a few minutes it ceased. As she remained at the window in expectation of hearing it again, she observed the form of a female glide down one of the avenues. Her senses were awakened. She no longer listened for the music, but hurrying on her clothes, quitted her apartment, and relating her discovery to 3 confidential nuns, went accompanied by them into the garden in search of the fugitive. They traversed the most secret parts with no effect, until they came opposite a rugged tower that rose above the wall covered with ivy. They there discovered a man seated upon a projection of the ruin, apparently waiting for the approach of some person in the garden. As the moon shone upon the scene, they could plainly perceive him to be a cavalier of some distinction, by the diamonds which sparkled in his hat and those that adorned the hilt of his sword. "The mystery will soon be cleared up," exclaimed the abbess. "No punishment can be inflicted on the sister who encourages these unholy revels that will equal the crime." She had not uttered the words a moment when a nun appeared clad in a deep black veil. "Oh, my love, my adored angel!" cried the cavalier as he sprang from the wall to the ground. "I thought the night would have passed without my seeing you." "Hush," she cried, "for my mother is awake. I heard her chamber window open as I descended the stairs in the tower next to her cell. If she should detect us, I am lost forever." "Impossible," the Marquess. "By this sacred kiss, I'll—" "Hold," cried the abbess, as she rushed between them with a drawn dagger. "Hold. Violate the chastity of those lips, and you die." The shrieks of Florella instantly brought his attendants upon the wall. "Fly," said the abbess to her nuns. "Fly to the great gate and cry through the streets the situation we're in." "Hear me," exclaimed the Marquess as he threw himself on his knees. "Hear me before you attempt the sacrifice of my life. Suffer me to retire undisturbed from the garden this night, and tomorrow I pledge myself to explain the whole of this affair." At the intercession of the nuns, his request was not without difficulty granted. The Marquis, I can never say it, retired to his lodgings, disturbed to a degree by this unfortunate adventure. He cursed the impolitic speech he whispered in a moment of levity in the ear of the old abbess as she sat in her confessional. He laid the whole night devising upon the best means to explain the matter to the abbess. At first he thought of concealing his birth and fortune, but upon reflection he supposed that acting honourably might in some measure be the means of quieting the tempest he had raised in St. Anna's mind. He therefore pursued this resolution and wrote the following letter to the abbess. "Most worthy of your sex, the nun with whom I am in love being your daughter, I think myself bound by that circumstance alone to act with truth and honour. My affection is unbounded. It cannot be erased by contempt or inattention from anyone but the object of my heart. Our meetings have been secret, but those hours have never been devoted to the licentious triumph of our passions. I am a nobleman. My title is the Marquis de las Méridas, nephew to Don Astura, who left me in his possessions, which lie in the kingdom of Aragon. They are ample in the extreme. Let me rescue your daughter from the inconsiderate and worthless vows imposed upon her by religion. I have it in my power to effect it. Constant in my affection, I vow to God never to quit Madrid until she is in my possession, if you refuse me this request. It is in St. Anna's disposition to Is it in St. Anna's disposition to bury innocence, virtue, and beauty in the gloomy cloisters of a convent? Can she witness her daughter in the prime of life bending before the shrine of some departed saint and telling a few amber beads rather than have her a beloved mother of a happy family? Oh no, she will cherish the affection Florella entertains for me, and by relieving her from her religious engagements, restore peace to her bosom and happiness to my bosom and happiness to hers. Meridas. He read it over several times. He found it not the exact prototype of his imagination, but his mind was too deeply agitated to make it better. He dispatched a servant with it to the convent and bid him wait for an answer. When the abbess had in some measure recovered her confusion and terror, she ordered Florella into her cell and peremptorily demanded the keys of her escritoire. The girl at first refused to obey the mandate by the accustomed artifice of bursting into tears. It had no effect upon her mother. She forced them from her, and hurrying to her cell, opened the drawers with all the furor of an inquisitorial familiar. She discovered nothing of any consequence. Unfinished drawings and preserved flowers alone occupied its secret recesses. A suspicious glance, however, from St. Anna upon the countenance of her daughter, bathed in tears, procured the testimonials of Florella's guilt. Spare me, my dear mother, and I will discover all. There, she cried, trembling with dreadful apprehension. There they are. You will find them all there. She put into her mother's hands a small model of the Virgin Mary. The abbess examined it with attention and discovered the lady to be hollow, with a little trapdoor at the bottom of her embroidered petticoat. She started with horror, for on opening it, a multitude of amorous billets tumbled out of the lady's sanctuary. She read some of them with distraction. They were signed Jerome. Jerome? She exclaimed. Jerome? Oh, God! Mother, they're not the letters you want. She ran to the table and presented one from the number to her mother. The seal bore an impression of Donna Stura's arms. She started with surprise. At that moment, a nun entered with a letter directed to the abbess. She opened it with an unaccountable tremor. It was from the Marquis. She turned to the affrighted Florella. Where did you first see him? In the chapel of the Augustine friars. And do you love him? She exclaimed. Oh, my dear mother, I found everything in the shape of man I have ever yet witnessed. I must treat you rigorously, said St. Anna, for the sake of observing the rules of the order, but you will bear it with patience and consider it only as a preliminary step to your future happiness. Oh, my dear mother. Hush. The nuns are in the gallery. I shall summon you in about an hour to the parlour in order to explain to you the enormity of your crimes and pass the sentence adjudged upon you by the Council of Elders. She left the cell and found a crowd of nuns gathered upon the stairs of the gallery. They dispersed at her request, each one conjecturing what would become of poor Florella. The abbess instantly dispatched an answer to the Marquis's letter, and it was to the following effect. Dear Marquis, come instantly to the convent and desire to speak with me, said Anna. Rapture sparkled in his eyes when he read those few emphatic words. He wrapped himself in his cloak and went instantly to the convent grate. He demanded to see the abbess. As he passed through a part of the cloisters to the audience parlour, the nuns peeped at him with as much curiosity as if he had been a native of one of the new discovered islands. As he entered the room, the abbess rose from her seat and took him by the hand. Is it possible, she cried, that the Marquis de la Meridas can condescend to give his hand to the daughter of the ill-fated St. Anna? And do you suppose, he replied, that the daughter of St. Anna is unworthy to share with me my possessions? I love her, St. Anna, and though born in old Castile, would forego the greatest of all earthly advantages to live with my Florella. But mark me, if you have laid this scheme purposely to impose upon my credulity and dishonour my daughter... Merciful Father, he exclaimed as he lifted his eyes to heaven, if I debase the character of a man, may I incur the wrathful vengeance of my God, and be delivered up to justice as an example to mankind. He produced letters which bore the signature of Don Juan de Modena, brother to his aunt, in which the abbess observed he lamented that his nephew's affection should be placed upon the unattainable object, promises to apply to the Pope for a dispensation to release her from her vows, and a friendly offer of any services that lay within his power for the promotion of his happiness. These letters had great weight with St. Anna. She had, during her residence at the castle, frequently observed that Don Juan de Modena had the confidence of his sister, and ever since the period when her husband was killed in a battle with the Moors, that she always looked up to him for advice and protection. There is no one person on earth to whom I should prefer my daughter to be united than to the Marquis of Meridas. Your aunt befriended me in my distress, and to Florella behaved as a mother. But although my daughter is not bound by any vows to a life of celibacy within the walls of this convent, several very serious circumstances occur to prevent your immediate union. She has transgressed the strict rules of the order, and in so doing must suffer the punishment prescribed by the laws. You will not, he exclaimed, you cannot hurt her. The punishment is severe, but when the clock strikes 2, if you appear upon the same broken part of the wall as you did when we discovered you, with a confessor, the marriage may be celebrated in our chapel. Oh God, the hour is 2. Yes. And with a priest upon the broken tower. Yes. Farewell then, till that auspicious hour. He quitted the monastery and retired to his lodgings, almost overpowered with this excess of joy, this unexpected change in his fortune created. He immediately dispatched a servant to the first convent for a priest. The good father arrived, stored with holiness and civility. My business with you, father, exclaimed the Marquis, is no less than to request you will marry me. It shall be complied with, good signor. He is preparing himself to officiate. Not now, my prince of sacrifices, but at 2 o'clock tomorrow morning. At 2 o'clock tomorrow morning? Yes. Can you climb a wall? And dare you marry me to a nun? A nun? Cried the affrighted father. Not for the thumb of St. Paul? No, I believe that. But will you for the wallet of St. Peter and its contents? He threw a purse upon the table, filled with gold. All ideas of virtue vanished, and as the conscientious father slipped it into his side pocket, a trap, no doubt, for many good things. Tell me, he said in a whisper, where am I to meet you at the appointed hour? By the north tower of St. Catherine's Monastery. St. Catherine's? I'll be there in waiting. During this curious interview between the Marquis and the friar, poor Florella was, upon a long hearing before the Council of Elders, condemned to be confined in a prison under the chapel for the space of a month upon bread and water. She heard her sentence with an affected degree of horror that seemed to speak the language of contrition. It was mitigated to 2 days. Night drew near, and preparations were making for conducting Florella with pompous form to her prison. The clock struck 12. The nuns had assembled in the great chamber. St. Anna seated herself in the midst of them, and manoeuvred away the time discussing unimportant subjects until it struck 1. She then ordered the procession to begin. It marched to the chapel with great solemnity, and having lodged Florella in her prison, returned to the convent. Exactly as the clock struck 2, the Marquis appeared upon the wall, supporting the trembling priest, who looked upon the probability of his falling from the tower with more horror than the crime of uniting a female enthusiast with a man of gallantry. He descended with great dread and difficulty, and accompanied the Marquis to the chapel. They found the abbess waiting their approach at the door. She conducted them to the altar, and taking a lamp which she had secreted for the purpose, descended into the vault where Florella was immured. In a few minutes she appeared with the affrighted Vestal at the altar. The Marquis clasped her in his arms, and the priest immediately performed the ceremony. When it was concluded, St. Anna embraced her daughter, and after bidding them an affectionate farewell, let them through a wicket into the street, to the great joy of the friar, who expected to ascend the wall again, without the assistance of Jacob's ladder or the wings of Gabriel, at the hazard of his life. St. Anna the next morning related the affair to the sisterhood. Expressions of alarm and astonishment ran through the whole multitude. Her marriage appeared to them in a different light to what it did to the abbess. They looked upon the transaction as an act unholy and impure. She wisely considered it as the most effectual step to secure her daughter in the possession of wealth and happiness. She wisely considered it the most effectual step to secure her daughter in the possession of wealth and happiness. In a little time, the circumstance so repugnant to the principles of the institution was forgotten, and St. Anna, by her unparalleled conduct, became revered more than ever by the sisters. Florella seldom visited her mother, but in her letter said she experienced from the Marquis the most tender and affectionate regard. But her hours were crowned with splendour and happiness, and from her attention to the peasantry residing near the castle, she had become their adoration. So that's the end of one massive chapter there, which had quite a lot of random things happen. I think theologically, one of the most interesting things that happens in this chapter, of course, is the idea of St. Anna taking confession. So I've already mentioned that we don't really know who the author is of this text, but this is one of the instances that makes me think it probably did have a female author. And there's certainly, it's quite a radical text, both in terms of its pro-toleration discourse, it's radically pro-tolerance, but it's also, in terms of gender, much more forward-thinking perhaps than some of the other texts from the period. You know, you have heroines who are actively defending themselves, and you have women taking on theological responsibility, not aside from men. So, you know, the abbess who rules over the nuns, but will always be working under the abbot or the priest, sort of aside, different from the mainstream of ecclesiastical authority. Here, St. Anna is being depicted very anachronistically, of course, and erroneously as taking over that masculine place of confession. So it's a really interesting little bit of the story for me. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. So much happening. I think the text tends to get the names wrong. So Bertram is a couple of different people at this point, but hopefully you followed it with me. I didn't want to pop in a correction in case I was wrong, but I think Bertram is still missing. And we were talking about Don Geraldo when Alexo married Amantha, his daughter, if I remember the names right. But Bertram, Cleanthe's lover, is still somewhere. We don't know where he is. So anyway, there we go. Still about half of this second book to read, so a couple of days left, but hopefully you'll be with me and we will enjoy the rest of the novel. Goodbye.